The M14 is usually introduced as a failure, but that word is too easy. A bad rifle can be mocked and left there. The M14 is more revealing because it was not born from stupidity. It was born from an institution trying to carry a familiar answer into a war that was already asking a different question. That is why the story matters. If you only ask whether the M14 was good or bad, the answer collapses into a debate about reputation. If you ask what problem the United States Army thought it was solving, the rifle becomes a document. It shows how doctrine, pride, ammunition standardization, manufacturing habits and battlefield imagination can all sit inside one object. The first useful point is this: the M14 was not trying to be strange. It was trying to be reassuring. It looked back toward a world where the rifleman was imagined as a disciplined individual, firing a powerful cartridge at meaningful distance, backed by training and tradition. It arrived after the M1 Garand had become part of American military identity. The Garand had served through a very different war and had earned a reputation that was not merely technical. It was cultural. So when the Army moved after the Second World War and into the NATO era, it did not begin with a blank sheet of paper. It began with habits that already felt proven. A new rifle needed to fit a new standard cartridge, but it also needed to feel like a continuation of what the Army already trusted. The M14 promised exactly that: a familiar shape of authority, a detachable magazine, selective fire ambition on paper, and a full-power cartridge that seemed to preserve range and seriousness. There is the contradiction. The rifle was sold by continuity, but the world around it was moving toward volume, mobility, shorter engagements, mechanized movement, and a different burden on the individual soldier. The M14 answered the question: how do we modernize the old battle rifle idea? But the more painful question was already forming: what kind of rifle does the next infantry war actually reward? The answer was not obvious to everyone at the same time. Institutions rarely change because one engineer writes a cleaner sentence. They change when training reports, supply pressure, field experience, and political embarrassment all begin pointing in the same direction. Before that, the older answer can look responsible. A full-power cartridge can look serious. Familiar controls can look safe. A wooden-stocked rifle can look like disciplined continuity rather than delay. That is why calling the M14 simply foolish misses the institutional logic. The Army wanted a rifle that could replace several older weapons in spirit, preserve the authority of the rifleman, and align with the NATO 7.62mm standard. It wanted the future without losing the emotional confidence of the past. On a procurement slide, that can sound like wisdom. On a muddy battlefield, it can become weight. The weight was not just physical. It was doctrinal. A soldier carrying a rifle carries an idea of what the Army expects from him. If the rifle is powerful but harder to control in rapid fire, that says something. If the ammunition is heavier, that says something. If the design is familiar to the training establishment, that also says something. A weapon is never just a weapon in a large military. It is a vote for a certain kind of soldier, a certain kind of fight, and a certain kind of supply chain. The M14's reputation suffered because those votes aged quickly. Vietnam did not create every flaw, but it made the mismatch difficult to ignore. Heat, movement, dense terrain, short-range contact, and the need to carry enough ammunition all pushed against the assumptions behind a traditional full-power service rifle. The rifle had not been designed as a joke. It had been designed as a serious answer to a serious old problem. The tragedy is that serious old problems do not always remain the right problems. If this kind of history is useful to you, the point of the channel is not to rank weapons like sports cars. Subscribe for the institutional stories behind them: why Army select, keep, defend and eventually abandon the tools they once trusted. Now look at the M14 selective fire promise. On paper, a rifle that can offer both aimed semi-automatic fire and automatic fire sounds efficient. In practice, that promise collided with the cartridge, the rifle's weight, the soldier's body and the realities of training. The important lesson is not a technique. The lesson is procurement language. A capability can exist in a specification and still be poor as a practical institutional answer. This happens all over military history. A feature can be technically present without being doctrinally persuasive. A committee can say a weapon does several jobs. The field can reply that it does one job acceptably and the others awkwardly. The M14 carried that tension. It wanted to be a rifleman's rifle, a bridge from the Garand, and a modernization step in the NATO age. That is too many expectations for one design to satisfy cleanly. The production story adds another layer. New weapons are not adopted in a vacuum. Factories, tooling, contracts, spare parts and political confidence all matter. A radical new system asks an institution to change more than a rifle. It asks it to change the rhythm of maintenance, the training literature, the ammunition pipeline, and the mental model of the soldier who carries it. The M14 looked attractive partly because it did not demand the same psychological rupture. It felt like modernization with less cultural shock. That softer landing was a major part of the appeal. The Army could tell itself that it was not abandoning marksmanship culture, not abandoning the full-power rifle idea, and not abandoning the lineage that had carried it through the last Great War. A detachable magazine and a new cartridge standard could be framed as progress, while the overall philosophy remained recognizable. That made the decision easier to sell inside the institution. It also made the hidden weakness harder to confront. The hidden weakness was not that every soldier suddenly needed a completely different tool in every situation. The weakness was that the center of gravity was shifting. The Army was about to discover that the ordinary infantry burden was not only a question of individual skill. It was a question of how much ammunition could be carried, how quickly a unit could respond, how weapons behaved under stress, and how much training time could realistically overcome the physics of a powerful cartridge in a lightweight shoulder weapon. But the cost of reducing shock at the start can be paid later. When the battlefield reveals that the old assumptions are weak, the institution must change under pressure rather than by choice. That is when replacement becomes messy. The M14 entered service with the confidence of a final answer, but it soon became a transition object. It stood between the Garand world and the small caliber, high-velocity future that would define the American service rifle debate for decades. The sharpest part of this story is that many criticisms of the M14 are true while still being incomplete. Yes, the rifle was heavy compared with what came next. Yes, the cartridge and automatic fire ambition created a difficult combination. Yes, its moment as the standard American service rifle was short. But those facts only tell us what happened. They do not explain why intelligent people thought the decision made sense. To understand that, you have to return to the post-war imagination. The United States had won a global war with industrial power and a rifle culture that still valued range, marksmanship, and authority. NATO standardization made a powerful cartridge politically and logistically attractive. The M1 Garand had created trust in a certain pattern of rifle. A lighter, more radical idea could look unproven, even unserious, beside that inheritance. This is where the M14 becomes more than a weapon story. It becomes a warning about institutional memory. Memory is useful when it prevents fashion from replacing judgment. It is dangerous when it turns yesterday's success into tomorrow's requirement. The Army did not simply cling to the past because it loved nostalgia. It trusted lessons that had once been paid for in blood, money, and production effort. The problem was that some lessons expire before institutions admit it. You can see the same pattern in many military decisions. The old system is not defended only because it is old. It is defended because it has witnesses. Veterans remember it. Instructors know how to teach around it. Factories know how to support it. Senior officers associate it with a proven mental picture of discipline. By contrast, the new system arrives with promises, test reports, and uncertainty. The old idea has a biography. The new idea has a proposal. There is also a visual irony. The M14 looks like a serious rifle. Long, solid, traditional, almost respectable in the way mid-century military equipment can appear respectable. That visual language matters. People often trust objects that look like they belong to a proven world. The early AR-15, by contrast, looked unfamiliar and lightweight. One looked like continuity. The other looked like a risk. History did not care which one looked more respectable. That does not mean the M14 had no value. It continued in specialized roles, ceremonial contexts, marksmanship programs, and later adaptations. But survival in niche roles is not the same as success as a general infantry answer. The difference matters. A tool can be excellent at one narrow task and still fail the broader job it was adopted to perform. Military reputation often becomes confused because people argue about the wrong mission. So was the M14 America's worst service rifle? The more honest answer is that it may be America's most revealing transition rifle. It reveals the final confidence of the old battle rifle idea. It reveals how NATO standardization and American tradition reinforced each other. It reveals how a specification can promise too much. And it reveals how quickly a weapon can become outdated when the institution is solving the last war's problem with great seriousness. That is why the word worst should be treated as an invitation, not a verdict. The rifle's short standard service life is damning, but the reasons behind that short life are more useful than the insult. A bad reputation can teach almost nothing if it becomes a punchline. The M14 teaches a great deal because its failure was respectable. It came from a chain of decisions that made sense to people who were not trying to fail. If you want to argue the word worst, the useful question is not whether the rifle had virtues. It did. The useful question is whether those virtues belong to the problem the army actually faced. Put your answer in the comments as a historical argument, not a fan team vote. Was the M14 a bad rifle or a good rifle adopted for the wrong moment? The middle of the story turns on that distinction. A bad rifle is easy to dismiss. A wrong moment rifle is harder because it forces us to admit that institutions can be rational and still be late. The M14 did not fail because every assumption behind it was absurd. It failed because enough assumptions were aging at the same time: expected engagement distances, ammunition burden, controllability, training model, and the relationship between individual precision and unit firepower. That is also why the replacement debate became so charged. The M16 did not simply replace a rifle. It challenged a worldview. It suggested that lighter ammunition, different recoil behavior, different materials, and a different idea of infantry fire could matter more than the old measure of full power authority. Whether one loves or hates what came next, the shift was enormous. The M14 made that shift visible because it stood so close to the dividing line. There is a procurement lesson here that applies far beyond rifles. The most dangerous sentence in any institution is, "We already know what good looks like." Sometimes that sentence protects standards. Sometimes it blocks perception. In the M14 story, good meant powerful, familiar, robust in the old sense, and connected to a heroic memory. The next war asked for something less romantic and more adaptable. The final judgment should be cold. The M14 was not a cartoon disaster. It was a respectable answer trapped in a shrinking window. Its short life as the standard service rifle was not an accident, it was evidence that the question had changed faster than the institution wanted to admit. That is why the rifle still attracts debate. People are not really arguing about wood, steel, and cartridge alone. They are arguing about what the infantryman was supposed to be, what kind of war the United States expected, and how hard it is for a victorious institution to stop trusting the shape of its last success. If that distinction helped cut through the usual argument, leave a like so this kind of grounded weapons history reaches more viewers who want context instead of hype. The M14's legacy is not that every old idea is wrong. The legacy is that continuity has to be earned again every time the battlefield changes. A familiar weapon can comfort an institution precisely when it should be making that institution uncomfortable. The M14 looked backward with confidence, stepped into a new era, and discovered that confidence is not the same thing as fit. That is the final reason the story still matters. The M14 is not only about one rifle between the Garand and the M16. It is about the cost of late translation. The institution had to translate victory-era confidence into Cold War reality, then translate that into Vietnam's conditions, then translate that again into a new service rifle philosophy. Every translation came with friction. The rifle was caught in the middle, carrying the dignity of an older answer into a future that did not reward dignity by itself. In the end, the rifle's greatest value may be as a warning label. Not a warning about one mechanism or one specification, but about decision-making. Armies do not just adopt weapons. They adopt assumptions. The M14 shows what happens when the assumptions are dignified, well-defended, historically understandable, and still not quite right for the war that arrives. That is why the argument still refuses to die.